All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We know you, our listener, love a good head scratcher. And today we're going deep on something that might just tickle that philosophical fancy of yours.
Yeah, dynamic choice.
Dynamic choice. So think of it like this. Why do we sometimes take a bunch of steps that on their own make total sense, but somehow lead us to a place we didn't really want to be?
Yeah. We all end up in situations where we make what seems like the right choice at each individual moment. But when we look back, the overall outcome isn't what we hoped for.
Right. So, to help us unpack this puzzle, we're diving into some excerpts today from, get this, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
That sounds
This is
dense.
a real brain tickler. But this entry on dynamic choice lays out a pretty powerful way of thinking about these situations. It even brings in some interesting connections to psychology and economics.
Oh, so we're talking about more than just like armchair philosophy here.
Exactly. We're going to try and really get to the core of the challenges and explore some of the solutions that philosophers and researchers have come up with when it comes to dynamic choice. And we'll be focusing on the stuff that we think will really resonate with you, our philosophically minded listener. Stuff like, what do we even mean by value? And how do we define rationality when choices play out over time? And even, like, what does it even mean to have a consistent self when you're making decisions that affect your future?
Yeah, like how do we even know who that future self will be?
Right? It gets really deep.
Yeah.
So, to kick things off, let's talk about something that immediately throws a wrench in our intuitive ideas about value:
Yeah.
incommensurable
Right.
alternatives.
This is where things start to get really interesting.
So, we often find ourselves facing choices where neither option is clearly better than the other.
Right. But it's not like they're equal either.
Exactly. And this kind of messes with our usual way of thinking about value. We often assume that if A isn't better than B and B isn't better than A, then they must be equally good.
Like they're on the same level.
Right. But with incommensurable alternatives, that's not the case. It's like there's no single ruler that we can use to measure their value and compare them directly.
They're like apples and oranges.
Perfect analogy. The source even gives this example of someone named Kay trying to decide between a 6-day beach vacation with her
Oh, that
kids.
sounds nice.
Right, or a 2-month oil painting course.
So like relaxation versus pursuing a creative passion.
Exactly. And it's not obvious at all that one is objectively better than the other. And here's where it gets even trickier. Even if you make one option a little more appealing, like, say, you extend the vacation to 7 days,
So it's longer?
right, it doesn't automatically become better than the painting course. It's not just a simple case of more being better. There's no direct way to compare those two things and say, okay, more relaxation time always trumps the chance to develop an artistic skill.
So how do you choose?
That's the million-dollar question. And the point here is that when you can't clearly say that one option is better, that doesn't mean you're free from future regret. In fact, it can be even more tricky. Because when you're dealing with these kinds of incomparable things, the choices you make in each moment, even if they seem reasonable at the time, can add up to a situation you end up really not liking.
Yeah, it's like every little choice matters.
Absolutely. It's not just about the immediate decision, it's about how those decisions play out over time. So the fact that we can't always compare things directly raises some really big questions about how we even think about comparability.
Yeah, like how do we make sense of those situations where it's not about better or worse, but something else entirely?
Right. So even though these incommensurable alternatives can't be neatly ranked as better, worse, or equal, some philosophers, like Ruth Chang, have argued that they might still be comparable in different ways, like they might be on a par with each other.
Like two equally valid paths, but in different directions.
Exactly. But even with this more nuanced understanding of comparability, we're still left with this core problem. How do we make rational choices over time when faced with these kinds of alternatives?
Right, because it's not like life just stops after one decision.
Definitely not. And to see just how sticky these situations can get, let's look at an example from the source material. It talks about Broom, another philosopher, who analyzed the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac.
Okay, the sacrifice story.
That's the one. God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. And now, think about the choice Abraham is facing: obey what he believes is a divine command or save the life of his child. It's incredibly difficult, maybe even impossible, to weigh those two things against each other.
You've got religious obedience on one hand and the value of a human life on the other.
Exactly. And not just any human life, his own son.
Uh-huh.
So Broom's point is that these options are incommensurable. There's no easy way to say which one is better.
So how does that play out in terms of dynamic choice?
Well, think about it. Abraham's initial decision to obey God and set out for the mountain. In that moment, it seems like a rationally permissible choice. I mean, he places immense value on following God's will.
Right, so in that moment, it makes sense.
But here's the dynamic twist. Once he's at the foot of the mountain, he might start to rethink things. And the choice between turning back and saving Isaac versus going through with the sacrifice could feel just as impossible to compare as his original dilemma.
Because the situation has changed.
Exactly. And what Broom points out is that turning back at this point, even though it means saving Isaac, could actually lead to a worse outcome than if he'd never set out in the first place.
How so?
Well, because by that point, the journey and everything leading up to it have already damaged the trust and relationship between Abraham and Isaac.
So even though he'd be doing the right thing, the consequences are still really tough.
Exactly. And what's fascinating here from a philosophical point of view is how each individual decision, the decision to obey, the potential reconsideration, could be justifiable on its own. But when you look at the whole sequence, they lead to a worse overall outcome.
It's like taking a wrong turn and then another wrong turn and ending up way off course.
Perfect way to put it. Abraham ends up in a situation, a damaged relationship, living with the weight of his initial decision that he might have avoided if he'd made a different choice at the very beginning.
Like, what if he'd questioned God's command from the start? Or tried to figure out a different approach?
Right. So the big takeaway for you, our listener who loves to ponder these things, is that when we're dealing with values that are hard to compare, a bunch of decisions that make sense individually can add up to a result that nobody would have chosen intentionally.
So it's like, even with good intentions, you can end up somewhere you really don't want to be.
Exactly. Okay, so let's switch gears a bit and talk about another big driver of these dynamic choice problems.
What's that?
Time-biased preferences.
So now we're getting into how our sense of time messes with our decision-making.
You got it. So time-biased preferences, it basically boils down to this. We tend to value immediate satisfaction way more than future satisfaction.
Oh, yeah, that instant gratification.
Right. It's like we're constantly discounting the value of things that will happen later. And the source material actually links this back to how animals behave.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, think about it. For an animal that's focused on survival, grabbing that small piece of food that's right there in front of it makes more sense than waiting for a maybe bigger reward later on.
Right, especially if that bigger reward might not even show up.
Exactly. And even though humans, we have this amazing ability to plan for the future and think abstractly, we're still influenced by the same basic bias.
We're still kind of stuck in that animal mindset sometimes.
It definitely seems that way. The source even includes some diagrams to help visualize this. Figure 1, it shows how we gradually start to value a future reward more as it gets closer in time.
Okay, so like the closer it gets, the more real it feels.
Right. But then figure 2, that's where things get really interesting. It shows what happens when these time preferences actually cross over.
What do you mean by crossover?
Well, imagine you have a choice between a small reward you can get soon and a larger reward that'll come later. When both of these rewards are far off in the future, we usually and rationally prefer the larger, later reward.
Makes sense. Who wouldn't want more, even if they have to wait a bit?
Right. But as that smaller reward becomes more and more immediate, its value in our minds starts to shoot up.
Because it's right there.
Exactly. And at some point, that smaller, sooner reward can actually feel more valuable than the larger, later one. That's the crossover point. And that's when we have what's called a preference reversal.
So we switch from wanting the big thing to wanting the small thing, just because of the timing.
Exactly. And haven't we all felt this pull in our own lives? Like, think about the classic struggle between saving for retirement and splurging on something you want right now.
The age-old battle of saving versus spending.
Right. Rationally, we all know how important it is to have a secure financial future. And most of us, we genuinely intend to save, but then payday comes around.
And suddenly that new phone is calling your name.
Or that fancy dinner out. And in that moment, that immediate pleasure just seems so much more appealing than that far-off retirement goal.
Yeah, because it feels so abstract and distant.
Right. And so we end up making choices that, little by little, chip away at our long-term financial goals. So when we talk about discounting future utility, it's really just a fancy way of saying that we often care less about our future self's well-being than our present desires.
Yeah, it's like our present self is in a constant negotiation with our future self. And the present self usually wins.
It often does, but what's really philosophically interesting is that the source material also talks about something called future bias.
Future bias. So it's like the opposite of present bias.
Kind of. It's this idea that we might actually value future satisfaction more than past satisfaction.
So wait, we value things that will happen in the future more than things that have already happened, even good things.
It seems counterintuitive, right? But that's what the source material suggests. There's this example, a variation on the thought experiment by Derek Parfit. Imagine having to choose between having already endured a super painful 10-hour medical procedure yesterday
Oh, ouch.
or facing a slightly shorter 9-hour procedure tomorrow.
So a longer past pain versus a shorter future pain.
Exactly. And it's amazing how many people instinctively say they'd rather have already gone through the longer, unpleasant experience.
Really? So they actually prefer the past pain.
It seems that way. And the source material explains that this future bias, this tendency to discount past costs more heavily than future ones, can lead to a life that feels, well, less fulfilling.
So it's like we're constantly trying to avoid future regret, even if it means missing out on good things in the present.
That's the idea. There's another example in the source material about a guy named Massimo who loves massages.
Who doesn't love a good massage?
Right. But he's always faced with this dilemma. Should he schedule a longer massage for later or a shorter one right now?
Tough choice.
And because of this future bias, he almost always chooses the shorter massage for the future. He's trying to avoid the regret of having a pleasurable experience end too soon.
So he's constantly opting for less pleasure just to avoid potential future regret.
Exactly. And the result is, over time, he ends up experiencing less overall enjoyment. So while present bias might seem like the more obvious culprit in a lot of dynamic choice problems, future bias adds this whole other layer of complexity to how our perception of time affects our decisions. And it shows how even our attempts to avoid regret can sometimes backfire.
It's like we're fighting ourselves across time.
Right. Okay, so let's move on to another fascinating source of these dynamic choice puzzles: intransitive preferences.
Intransitive preferences. I think I need a little help with this one.
So here's the thing. With intransitive preferences, the problem isn't that our preferences change over time. It's that they're stable, but they're logically inconsistent.
How can a preference be inconsistent?
It has to do with this idea of transitivity. Transitivity is like this basic principle of rational preference. It says that if you prefer A to B and B to C, then you should also prefer A to C.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right. It seems pretty straightforward. But intransitive preferences, they break this rule, and it creates these weird loops where you can't rank your options in a consistent way.
Okay, so give me an example.
Sure. The source material talks about someone named Jay who's trying to choose between 3 job offers.
Classic dilemma.
Right. So job A, it's really stimulating, but it doesn't pay much.
Okay, so exciting but broke.
Exactly. Then there's job B, it's somewhat stimulating with decent pay. And finally, job C, it's not stimulating at all, but it comes with a really high salary.
So it's a trade-off between stimulation and money.
Right. Now, it's totally reasonable for Jay to prefer A to B because he values the stimulation more than a slight increase in pay.
Okay, so far so good.
And he might also prefer B to C because he thinks that some level of stimulation is worth sacrificing a bit more money.
Yeah, makes sense.
But then here's the twist. He might also prefer C to A, because ultimately the high pay of job C outweighs the complete lack of stimulation when compared to the stimulating but low-paying job A.
So, wait, he prefers A to B, B to C, but then C to A? That's a circle.
That's exactly it. It's a preference loop. And this kind of circular preference is what makes things intransitive.
But how is that a problem?
Well, the source material points out that these kinds of preferences can make you vulnerable to being taken advantage of. There's this thing called the money pump argument.
Money pump. Sounds ominous.
Imagine someone named Alex who has these intransitive preferences when it comes to computers. He prefers computer A to B, B to C, and then C back to A. Let's say he currently owns computer C. Now, someone comes along and offers to trade him computer B for his C plus a little bit of money.
Which aligns with his preference.
Exactly. So Alex agrees. Now he owns B. Then this person offers him A for his B plus a little more money. Again, playing on his preferences. Alex agrees again, and now he has A. Finally, this person offers him C for his A, plus even more money. And guess what? Alex agrees. He ends up right back where he started, with computer C, but he's lost a bunch of money along the way.
So he's been manipulated because of his preferences.
Exactly. He's been money pumped. And this shows how someone with intransitive preferences can be systematically exploited.
Wow, so even if you're not aware of it, these kinds of preferences can really cost you.
They can. And the source material points out that even if Alex tries to anticipate these trades, there are more complex versions of the money pump argument that show he's still vulnerable to losing out in some way.
So there's no escaping the loop.
It really makes you question whether it's even rational to hold these kinds of inconsistent preferences.
Right, even if they feel natural or intuitive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's this really thought-provoking example in the source called the puzzle of the self-torturer.
Uh-oh, that doesn't sound good.
Imagine there's this device with, like, 1001 settings.
What kind of device?
It doesn't really matter. The point is, each setting increases the level of pain just a tiny, tiny bit. So small that you can barely even notice the difference.
Okay.
And every time you agree to move up to the next setting, you get a big financial reward, say $10,000.
That's tempting.
Right. But you can never go back down to a lower setting. So at each step, you might think, well, the increase in pain is so small, it's basically nothing. And I get $10,000. Of course I'll move up one setting.
Yeah, that makes sense in the moment.
Right. But the problem is, if you keep doing that, eventually you'll reach a point where the accumulated pain, despite all that money you've earned, is just unbearable.
So you end up in agony, even though you made a rational choice at each step.
Exactly. And the source material explains that this creates a kind of preference loop, just like our job example.
Because you prefer a slightly higher setting for a reward, but then you also prefer no pain at all over extreme pain.
Right. You prefer 1 to 0, 2 to 1, 3 to 2, and so on, all the way up to preferring 1,000 to 999. But then you also strongly prefer 0, no pain, to 1,000, unbearable pain. If your preferences were transitive, then preferring 2 to 1 and 1 to 0 would automatically mean you prefer 2 to 0, and so on, all the way up, which means you should prefer 1,000 to 0.
Which makes no sense. Nobody would choose that much pain, even for a ton of money.
Exactly. So the self-torturer's preferences are clearly intransitive, and the philosopher who came up with this, Warren Quinn, he points out that this isn't just some weird thought experiment. We all have tendencies toward these kinds of intransitive preferences in our everyday lives.
So give me a real-life example.
Okay, think about something like food. We enjoy eating delicious food, but we also want to be healthy and look good, right?
Sure.
So each additional bite might feel totally insignificant in the moment.
Like, one bite won't hurt.
Right. But if you keep making that choice bite after bite, over time, you might end up overeating and feeling bad about yourself. It's like the self-torturer, but with food instead of pain.
So it's like those little choices, they add up in a way we don't always anticipate.
They do. So even though these intransitive preferences might seem understandable, even justified, in each individual moment, acting on them consistently can really lead us down a path we don't want to be on. The source material highlights some philosophers like McIntosh and his idea of unacceptable situations, and Andreu with his work on subjective appraisal responses. They argue that we need to look beyond just our immediate preferences if we want to make truly rational decisions.
So it's not just about following our gut feeling every time.
Right. We have to think about the bigger picture and think about the consequences of those choices over time.
Okay, I'm starting to see the pattern here.
Good. So now let's talk about something else that can mess us up, even when our preferences are consistent and transitive. Vague goals.
So now even our goals are causing problems.
It's not that the goals themselves are bad, it's that they're not specific enough. And this vagueness can lead to all sorts of dynamic choice issues.
Give me an example.
Okay, the source material talks about the goal of writing a good book. Sounds like a great goal.
Sarah, who wouldn't want to write a good book?
But it's super vague. And the source material points out 5 things that make this kind of goal a recipe for dynamic choice problems.
Lay it on me.
First, it involves a ton of little actions, all those words you got to write. And each individual action, like writing one sentence, might feel totally insignificant to the overall success of the book.
Yeah, I see that.
Second, at almost any given moment, there's probably something else you'd rather be doing than writing. Checking your phone, watching TV, literally anything.
Oh, definitely. Writing can be hard work.
It is. And third, the problem is, if you keep choosing those other activities, those little distractions, over and over again, you'll never actually finish the book.
So all those small choices add up to failure.
Exactly. Fourth, despite all that, we still usually prefer to have a finished, good book than to never have started or given up.
So we want the end result, but we struggle with the process.
Bingo. And this is where it gets really interesting in terms of dynamic choice, because it's all those little, seemingly rational decisions, taking a break, checking email, that can end up derailing the entire project.
Like death by 1,000 paper cuts.
I love that analogy. Each individual choice to go for that immediate gratification, it seems harmless in the moment. But when you add them all up, it's a recipe for disaster.
It's like you said before, those small choices can lead you down a path you really don't want to be on.
Exactly. And there's this philosopher, Ferrero, who talks about activities having these things called non-local connections. It's like some activities aren't just a series of isolated moments. They require you to be engaged with the whole thing from start to finish.
So you can't just focus on the individual steps. You have to think about the bigger picture.
Right. And he calls this the diachronic will. It's like this sustained commitment to the long-term goal. But our proximal concerns, those immediate temptations and distractions, they can really get in the way.
So it's like a battle between our short-term desires and our long-term goals.
Exactly. And with vague goals, it's even harder to stay focused because it's not always clear how those little choices are connected to the end result.
Yeah, it's like you're wandering through a fog.
Perfect way to put it. Okay, so let's move on to a slightly different and maybe even more mind-bending type of dynamic choice problem:
Hit me with it.
autonomous benefit cases.
Autonomous benefit cases. Now that's a mouthful.
I know, right? But bear with me because
Yeah.
these cases are wild. There's situations where you actually benefit from just intending to do something, even if you never actually do it.
Wait, so you get the benefit just from thinking about doing something?
Pretty much. And in fact, you might even be worse off if you actually followed through on that intention.
Okay, now I'm really confused.
I know, it sounds crazy, but the classic example is this thought experiment called the toxin puzzle. It was dreamed up by this philosopher, Gregory Kafka. So picture this. There's this eccentric billionaire who offers you a deal. He's got a vial with a toxin in it.
A toxin, like poison.
Yeah, something that'll make you really sick for a day if you drink it, but it won't have any lasting effects.
Okay.
So here's the deal. If by midnight tonight you genuinely intend to drink this toxin tomorrow morning, he'll deposit $1 million into your bank account first thing in the morning.
$1 million just for intending to drink some nasty toxin.
Exactly. And here's the catch. The money is all yours before you even have to touch the vial. So you wake up in the morning, $1 million richer. Now ask yourself, is there any logical reason to actually drink the toxin at that point?
Well, no. You already have the money, and drinking it will just make you sick.
Exactly. So rationally speaking, your best move is to not drink the toxin. But here's where the puzzle really kicks in. Knowing that your future self has absolutely no reason to drink the toxin, can you, right now, genuinely form the intention to drink it tonight?
That's a good question. Because I know I wouldn't drink in the morning. So how can I really intend to do something I know I won't do?
That's the paradox. The billionaire isn't paying you to drink it. He's paying you to intend to drink it. And it seems almost impossible to truly intend to do something that, with absolute certainty, you'll have no reason to do when the time comes.
So it's like a mental trap. You could get $1 million, but only if you can convince yourself to do something you know you won't do.
Right. And this really gets to the heart of how tricky it is to make decisions that affect our future selves. It shows how our present intentions and our future actions can sometimes clash in really weird ways.
Okay, so we've explored all these different ways that dynamic choice problems can pop up. Now let's shift gears and talk about some potential solutions.
All right, I'm ready for some answers. So one approach that the source material talks about is called rational irrationality. Rational irrationality. That sounds like a contradiction. I know, right? But it basically means that sometimes acting in a way that seems irrational in the short term can actually be a smart strategy to avoid a worse outcome in the long run.
Okay, so give me an example.
The source material uses this example. It's called Schelling's answer to armed robbery.
Sounds intense.
So imagine this guy, Mo. He's being threatened by a robber. Just before things get really bad, Mo takes this drug that makes him act totally irrational. Like, he starts shouting crazy things, maybe even about wanting his kids to die.
Oh, wow, that escalated quickly.
I know, it's a pretty extreme example. But the point is, Mo's irrational behavior throws the robber off completely. All of a sudden, the robber's threats and his rational plan, they don't work anymore.
Because Mo is unpredictable.
Exactly. And the best thing for the robber to do at that point is just run away.
So Mo's craziness actually saves him.
In a way, yeah. It's obviously not a very practical solution for everyday life, but it illustrates the principle. Sometimes, by deliberately acting irrationally, you can change the situation and make it so that the other person's rational choices work in your favor.
Interesting. But like you said, not exactly a strategy I can use at the grocery store.
Probably not. But the source material suggests that maybe we do use less extreme forms of this strategy in our lives without even realizing it.
Like what?
Things like self-deception or even believing in superstitions. They might seem irrational on the surface, but maybe they help us deal with certain situations, especially those tricky ones that resemble the toxin puzzle.
So maybe a little bit of healthy irrationality can be a good thing.
Potentially. There's a philosopher, Alfred Meillet, who's done a lot of work on this idea of motivated irrationality. It's worth checking out if you're interested. But for a more practical approach to tackling these dynamic choice problems, the source material talks about the importance of external incentives.
External incentives, so like rewards and punishments.
Exactly. By setting up external rewards for sticking to our plans or punishments for veering off course, we can basically change how our future selves will see those choices.
So we're kind of manipulating our future selves.
In a way, yeah. But it's all about making it more likely that we'll make the choices that are good for us in the long run.
Makes sense.
Like, think about those retirement savings plans that automatically take money out of your paycheck and then hit you with a penalty if you try to withdraw the money early.
Yeah, I've got one of those.
Those are pre-commitment devices. They're like external constraints that we put on ourselves to fight that urge for immediate gratification.
It's like tying your hands so you don't do something you'll regret later.
Exactly. And speaking of tying yourself up, the source material even mentions Odysseus and the sirens.
Oh yeah, the whole tied to the mast thing.
That's right. Odysseus knew he wouldn't be able to resist the siren song, so he literally had his crew tie him to the mast so he couldn't steer the ship toward them. It's a pretty extreme example, but it shows the power of limiting your future self's choices to protect yourself from temptation.
Yeah, sometimes you got to get creative.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Now, for a slightly different approach, there's this idea of symbolic utility. It was developed by the philosopher Robert Nozick. And it basically means that we can give certain actions a symbolic meaning that goes beyond their immediate consequences.
Okay, so like how does that work in practice?
Well, think about the self-torturer example again. Instead of focusing just on that tiny increase in pain from moving up one setting, you could try to associate that action with the ultimate outcome, reaching a level of pain that's just unbearable.
So you're linking that one small action to the bigger, scarier consequence.
Exactly. And in a more everyday situation, maybe you're tempted to have another serving of food at dinner. Instead of focusing on how good that extra food will taste, you could try to connect it in your mind with the idea of gaining weight and being unhealthy.
So you're giving that extra serving a symbolic meaning that goes beyond just the immediate pleasure.
Exactly. By doing this, we can change how we see those choices in the moment and make it more likely that we'll choose what's good for us in the long run.
So it's like we're using our imagination to reframe those tempting choices.
Right. We're using symbolism to tap into our deeper values and motivations.
Interesting. So what are some other ways we can deal with these dynamic choice problems?
Well, the source material also dives into the role of planning and resoluteness.
Okay, so this is about actually sticking to our plans.
Exactly. Philosophers like Michael Bratman, David Gauthier, and Edward McLennan, they argue that a key part of being rational is having clear plans for the future. And then having the willpower to actually follow through on those plans.
Easier said than done, right?